I'm Vanessa Teitelbaum with the CAQ. So thanks everyone for joining. This is a webinar related to enterprise risk management, and I am thrilled to have Brian Schwartz from PwC and David Herzog, who is an audit committee member and on our audit committee council.
First of all, it's great to be with all of you who are participating on the in the webinar here. It's great to be on the panel with David and Vanessa. I'm a partner with PwC and the ERM leader for the U.S. firm. I really spend all my time working with boards, executives, and risk leaders in both assessing and building out their, I'll call it fit-for-purpose risk management programs and second-line risk management functions. And I'm also an adjunct over at Carnegie Mellon University, where probably close to 8-9 years ago, I helped the school develop a Chief Risk Officer certificate program. So I teach there, and we sort of really focus on new and experienced CROs and help them understand what sort of good looks like when it comes to risk management. So again, it's great to be with you today.
Hi, I'm David Herzog. I am the chair of the MetLife Audit Committee, and I'm also chairman of the board at DXC Technology. I joined that board and was the audit committee chair there as well. Prior to joining board service, I was the CFO for AIG from October of 2008 through April of 2016 when I retired. I've been a controller and a divisional chief financial officer throughout operating businesses across the globe. Got my start at Coopers & Lybrand decades ago. So been in the insurance and financial services space for a number of decades, and finance professional in that. So it is great to be with you all, because it's a very important topic for boards to have a firm understanding of, as Brian said, what good looks like, and should be a great discussion. So Vanessa, back to you.
So again, thank you so much. We are going to launch a quick polling question so that we can understand our audience here a little bit. And that question is, what is your role at your company or as a board member? And as you heard earlier, the polling questions are important for you to complete so that we can give you CPE credit. And then we will, just going to get rid of that for a second. And then we'll share those results in a minute. But to level set, Brian, can you please describe for our audience, what do we mean by ERM? Risk management is a common term. Risk assessment is common, but when we say enterprise risk management, can you help us with that to start?
Absolutely, happy to. It's one of those terms where you ask 10 people for the definition and you get 10 different answers. Hopefully pretty close answers, but variations for sure. So I would describe it this way in its most basic sense. It's a set of processes, right, sitting across the enterprise, across the company, whereby a company can identify, prioritize, manage, monitor, mitigate, report on their set of key business risks. Those risks align to its strategic plan or its strategic initiatives or priorities, and does so to enable both enable and protect the company by sort of staying inside the lines of a defined risk appetite. And we'll talk about all these things throughout the discussion today. What it's not defined as, and you alluded to this, Vanessa, when you teed up the question, it's not an annual risk assessment, right? That's an important component of it, but that's only one of several things you need to do. And it really can't be a paper exercise. So more to come, but that's how I sort of describe it for boards in that most basic sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. And let's share our results quickly with the audience. So we have 17% board members between public and private. A good half of us are auditors. Can you talk about risk appetite, David, and your experience as an audit committee member and how you communicate the organization's risk appetite and tolerance?
Sure. in terms of communicating it, it depends on the board and the structure. And as Brian alluded to earlier, there's no one size, no one perfect model. And Brian used the phrase fit for purpose. So in communicating the risk appetite, it has to be well defined. And I would say it's a living and breathing document exercise. It's not static at all. It's looked at, and yeah, it's not a once and done exercise by any means. To be good at it and for it to have purpose for the board, because as an oversight, you want to be thoughtful about what it is you're measuring, and then have confidence in those measures, and then evaluate periodically. And in our case, in the boards I'm on, it's done at least quarterly, where we look at the component parts of the risk appetite statement and discuss them in a committee. And we have, again, there's no one size fits all. I'm on one board where it's the ERM oversight's in risk and finance, so there's a finance committee, and another it's bolted on to the audit committee. So it just depends. But there's a great deal of transparency around the metrics and a clear defined where you're in a green zone, where you're in yellow or caution, and clear action steps if and when you get into areas of heightened risk, depending on the category.
And I know, David, you mentioned you're on a couple boards, and I know your tenure I think you recently rotated off a board. So let's say this is a little bit of an audible. Let's say you're new to a board. How are you going to understand? I mean, maybe that's part of the onboarding process, or maybe you take that into consideration before you decide to join a board. But like if you don't know the company that well, how would you get a sense of what the risk appetite is? You're saying it's explicit. Is it a statement? Is it?
It's explicit to the extent that there's, like in the case of MetLife, we have a risk appetite statement and literally a 5-page dashboard that we as a committee, I'm a member of the committee, the Risk and Finance Committee, that we review quarterly. So a new board member, if I were coming on to a board, one of the first things I would do would be to look at and study that risk appetite statement, because that would tell me a lot about the company. Does management have a firm grasp on it? And I'm sure, Brian, I'm sure you've seen good examples of good and some good examples of bad. And I think as a new director, particularly if you don't know the company, it would be good to study that. And and in terms of, if you don't know the industry per se, that's not fatal. It just means you have to go to school on what are the things that could go wrong. I think, and Brian, I'd love your thoughts on this. Risk management is as much about asking the could question. What could go wrong? Not necessarily did, and not being cynical about it, but it's the what could go wrong, and one's preparedness for that.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, David. We also see a big difference in risk appetite setting if you're a regulated company, or you're in a less regulated industry or sector. For those who probably aren't as advanced as some of the regulated industries, whether it's insurance or banking or something of that nature, risk appetite sometimes is sort of foreign language to companies even today, quite frankly. And it needs to be developed by management, right? Not the board. The board needs to accept it and understand it, like you said, David. But management needs to communicate it also out to the company and tell the company how to leverage it. It's not just a thing you put on the shelf. It's something that you leverage to make, I'll call risk-informed decisions, right? Business decisions out in the business. So it has to be something useful and used by the company. And the audit committee should really see how management is managing and monitoring and mitigating each key business risk against its defined risk appetite. So you're staying within the lines for that particular risk. Is that fair to say, David?
Yeah, it's great. It brings to mind, Brian, the idea or the notion of risk management and capital allocation.
Yep.
Because I think about it, MetLife. I mean, I give that management team an incredible amount of credit for having developed an enterprise-wide economic capital model, and that was a framework that was if nothing else, an expression of their risk appetite and expected returns across a whole wide range of criteria, geographies, products, capital intensity, et cetera. And it was a way to bring together risk, not just the dialogue of risk or the concept of risk, but how risk manifests itself in the products and the returns that were earned by that. And it basically levelized the playing field inside the company to better allocate capital and make good choices, better choices around where to lean in and where to pull back.
Yeah, and I'll make one more just comment, Vanessa, if I can, about risk appetite before you move us on here. If you don't have a defined risk appetite framework at your company, but you do have an enterprise risk management program in place, you really don't know if it's the right program. You know, it's like building a bridge over a body of water. You're not sure how wide the water is, but you build a bridge anyway. You might get it, you might not. So appetite really frames everything else because appetite's attached to the strategy. And the ERM has to be attached to the strategy or it's really irrelevant. So just wanted to share that point of view.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. As a lay person, not an ERM expert, I mean, I feel like, you know, like COVID kind of explained, I think a lot of people's not at the company level, but, you know, individuals' risk appetite, you know, we put ourselves in situations where all of a sudden your friends maybe were more comfortable or less comfortable in certain situations. And so, you know, it's something maybe you don't, I'm sure what you're talking about is clearly an important critical element, which is helpful. Brian, can you talk before we get into more on risk identification? Can you talk about sticking to risk identification? Can you talk about the types of risk that the company should be identifying and how those risks are allocated to responsible parties?
Yeah, sure. That's a good one because there's a lot of variation in how companies do this. So each company needs to have, or really needs to maintain what I'll call a risk taxonomy. You know, risk inventory, a risk catalog. It's really a taxonomy. It's a list of relevant risks that are either happening or could happen to your company based on your industry, based on your strategy, based on your size and geography and so forth and so on. So the risk taxonomy is where it sort of starts from. And a risk taxonomy should really have, some of you out there would have heard the term an L1 versus L2 versus L3, kind of level 1, level 2, level 3 risks. So most taxonomies that I advise my clients to have would be at least a L1 and L2 depth. So for example, L1 would be a category called operational risk, right? All taxonomies should have that on there as a category. Under operational category of risk, which is an L1, you would have an L2, which is, let's say, talent management, because talent management is an operational risk. And again, under that, you would have recruiting or retention. Those are examples of they could be examples of L3s. There's different ways to do it. Banking does it very formally, but other companies really have a choice how much depth to go into. But the risk taxonomy is sort of the starting point. And once a risk is deemed as a key business risk, the risk owner that's assigned at both the C-suite level and down below some delegated level, right, they have to do certain things around that risk. They have to mitigate it through a mitigation plan. They have to report on it where it stands against appetite. So you start with the taxonomy, you identify the key risks, and then you do certain things as a risk owner around those risks. So that's how Vanessa, how I would start that part of the conversation.
Can you just describe a little bit more when you say L1, L2, L3? Is L1 broader? Is L3 more severe? Like how do you distinguish? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And again, there's some places use L0, but I'm going to keep it simple. So an L1 would be one of four categories. You would have strategic risks, you would have operational risks, you would have compliance risks, and you would have financial risks. I would argue that any risk you can come up with will fit under one of those four L1 categories. And each of those categories has a list of risks underneath it, which are the L2s. Again, operational would have talent management, technology. Strategic would have mergers and acquisitions, brand management. Financial would have interest rate, market, credit risk. Compliance would have laws and regulations, SOX, and things of that nature. So it's just a categorization of all the risks that are relevant or could be relevant to the company.
Got it. Thank you. What about for David? Can you talk about examples of how audit committees you've been part of have influenced the company's risk-taking decisions? And I say that because before you were talking about risk appetite, and you made the comment it's not sort of good or bad. It sounds to me like it's just making sure that everybody's on the same page, right? Because there is risk and reward, and so nobody can predict the future. But if you're going to agree on pursuing a strategy and there's an understood risk, right? That's the point. But what happens if when there's a difference, in terms of how to approach?
Yeah,
I think what the risk is.
Right. Again, the backdrop to me is that a board oversees. We don't do. We oversee. We challenge. We inspect. We review. We provide feedback, input, sharing with management the lessons that we have learned over the course of our varying careers. So it's in that context that we help shape management's, if you will, appetite for it. Because again, as Brian talked about, there are these categories of risk. And again, depending upon a particular company's capital situation, the state of their business, the health of their business in terms of generating earnings and cash flow. And so I think, to me, it's not about telling a management team not to do something, but rather, because that's not our job. It's about questioning the range of outcomes that could occur with a particular strategy or whether it's product or investment or the like. So, that's how I look at it. And again, it's listen, if a management team is going to do something, and thankfully I've not had this situation where they're going to do something where you just know in your heart of hearts it's gonna end up badly. Well, as a director, you have an obligation to share that experience with management, and hopefully management's engaged enough to listen and course correct. But that's what your role is as a director, is to try to make sure that the management can leverage your past mistakes, because we've all made them. So
yeah. Let's launch our next polling question, and we can talk a little bit about this after we see the results. Who has responsibility for ERM at your company? So we're going to let people answer that. I will say we have an audit committee practices report that has been published now for 3 years, which we'll throw a link into the chat if we haven't already. And that those results show that nearly half of the companies we surveyed, the audit committee had responsibility, but a good 35% responded that the full board has responsibility. And then another, I think it was 15%, this is again our survey results, had a risk committee being responsible. But of course, that not all companies will have risk committees. So if we could share the results, let's see what this group says. Pretty similar, I would say. And it's hard to know. We might have more financial services folks. So we see a pretty high percentage of risk committee, but still the most common is audit committee and also the full board. Maybe Brian, what do you have a view on what's best practice for who should have responsibility?
Yeah, at the board level. So what you can't get away from is that risk oversight is a full board responsibility, regardless of how it's delegated down to committees. So I just wanted to make that point first. It's a full board responsibility, risk oversight. But with that said, most companies, most of my clients who don't have risk committees, and that is gaining popularity, by the way, even outside of the regulated industries. But those who don't, typically it falls on the audit committee, and it's built into the audit committee charter. So the audit committee is a typical place of the board that kind of runs point on risk management oversight for the full board. But we also encourage audit committee chairs, I'm sure David has done this, report back to the full board, about the risks that you're learning in audit committee. So that's what I would say there.
Okay. David, how does this square with your personal experience?
Yeah, I'm very much aligned with Brian's views there. Again, there's no one right or wrong model. It has to be, as Brian said, fit for purpose. And again, I've been on the two boards I'm on now. One, it sits in the audit committee, and the other, there is a finance and risk committee. But in the case of the one company where it's in the audit committee, I would just urge people to make sure they allow enough time, and that they give, because if you're gonna oversee risk management, there's a body of work and there's an amount of time that's required to do that. So in the one board, our audit committees are 2 hours or less, and that's what they are. They're very defined. In the other one, which includes the I'll call it risk and finance topics, they are 4+ hours. So again, neither is right or wrong, good or bad. It's just, but you've got to allow for appropriate time and space to allow an ample time to discuss and study and review the various aspects of risk management. So again, no right or wrong, but just make sure you leave enough time.
And Vanessa, I'll just add to that, because I think David, once again, is spot on. I think it also depends on what type of risk reporting is getting into the board package for the audit committee to review around risks or risk management. You need to David's point, leave time to really go through that and have the board members ask challenging questions back to either the chief risk officer, if you have one, or the CFO, whoever has a CRO type hat in the organization. You got to challenge and ask questions, and you do that off the data you receive through the audit committee or board package. So the one thing we see that we always comment to audit committees is you're not leaving enough time to really have robust discussions, and that's extremely important, to David's point.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, we lost power at my house last night, and I was like, oh shoot, why didn't I think about where my candles are, where my flashlights are? I should know this could happen. And then all of a sudden it happens. You're like, oh, I'm not prepared. I know that's a very minor example compared to the real challenges that companies have. Before we do our next polling question, which is going to be how often, let's talk a little bit about how often the risk assessment should be done. But one quick question for David, just in terms of collaborating with internal audit, what is your experience? And we're going to talk later about identifying emerging risks, but what is the role of internal audit in your experience?
Yeah, they play an obviously an integral role in risk oversight or risk assessment or risk identification. So again, I'm in two very different industries. The one is highly regulated financial services insurance. So you have what I'll say clearly defined lines of defense. First line being operations, second line being a defined, established enterprise risk management function, and then thirdly, the role of internal audit. And to me, it's vitally important that internal audit is independent and intellectually independent and structurally independent, but also they work very closely with ERM, so they're comparing notes along the way in terms of risks that are being identified. So the audit universe and the risk universe in internal audit, when we step back and we review internal audits, risk universe, and then we set the enterprise risk management's universe of identified risks, that together they cover the waterfront, if you will.
Okay. And I know we have several questions in the chat, which we'll get to. Some are on comp, which we didn't anticipate as part of our prepared remarks, but we can get to those at the end. Brian, go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment. David rightfully pointed out the 3 lines sort of model, and most people on the call probably know what that is, but some might not. The way I associate that to risk management is the following. First line is risk ownership. Second line is risk oversight. And third line is risk objective assurance. So I use the 3 O's just because it's easy to remember: ownership, oversight, objective assurance. To David's point, the third line, the internal audit function, they do have a defined role in risk management. First of all, their audit plan has to align to the key business risks. Otherwise, it's not a great audit plan, I would argue. And secondly, they can actually, and they should actually audit the second line risk management function and the program components itself. So I think they have a really defined and important role to play, to David's point.
Yeah, it's a great point, Brian. Great point.
Can you talk a little bit more, Brian, about objective assurance, ownership? I get what you're saying. Yeah. I assume management, oversight. I think you're saying that's the board's role. What's objective assurance? What do you mean by that?
So second line oversight is, yes, the board plays an oversight role for sure. But second line specific within the 4 walls of a company really refers to, the risk management group. It could be the corporate compliance group. It could be if maybe a SOC sits in there, controls testing. It's the things that the first line leverages and back and forth to make sure things are kept in check. And then objective assurance, to your question, Vanessa, really deals with an independent part of the company that has a direct functional line to the board, usually through David's role as audit committee chair. They're objective because they're independent, but they're giving assurance to the board and to the stakeholders that things are okay because of the audit plan.
Okay. We often refer to assurance in my line of work. So just curious. Of course, we often say independent assurance, similar perhaps.
Sure.
Let's launch our third polling question just to make sure everyone gets the CPE that they need. And this is, how often is the ERM assessment done at your company? And once we get the results, we'll see how your answers compare to our experts' view on best practices. Give it another minute or so. I don't want to wait too much. So maybe we'll just start with you. Brian, why don't we start with you? What's your view on, how often it should be done, an ERM assessment?
Yeah, so the risk assessment, which is part of ERM, obviously, the good news is that it's becoming more and more dynamic, and I know that was one of your polling question answers, dynamic. However, most of my clients, unless you're again in a let's say a banking industry or something very highly regulated with a lot of standards around it, companies are still doing, in my opinion, an annual risk assessment, maybe with a semi-annual refresh. something of that nature. And that's okay. It's not the best, but it's okay. But what I encourage those clients to do is have a list of triggering events that would trigger a risk assessment off cycle. Things like you're doing a strategic transaction, things like you're doing a business model shift, or you're going into a new geo, or you're implementing a major system, something that would truly shift your risk profile, and use that to do another risk assessment. So that's how I see it today in most non-heavily regulated companies, Vanessa.
Thanks. So let's share the results so everyone can see what this group is doing. So 14% dynamic, 9% is needed. The highest percentage is annual. David, how about for you? On the boards that you're on, how often is it performed?
Well, there is a formal annual ERM or risk assessment, but it's done so the program is reviewed, and I'll call it triggers, or the assessment, the measures, the metrics are looked at quarterly. And so there's I'll call it an implied or understood that while we're looking at the metrics, there's a dialogue around, well, are these still the right metrics? Just because that's what we said they were, is that still the right metric, or are there different metrics that we should be evaluating, or are there different measures? Because I think Brian alluded to it. If there's something in the business that's changing, whether it's self-induced or externally forced upon a company, it's incumbent upon you to take a look at the risks associated with that, and do you have the right measures? At the other end of the spectrum, it can't be so fluid that it's not meaningful, because for it to have meaning, if you have triggers, I think at Met we call it indicated action trigger. If you have those and you hit one of those, that's not an invitation to change the metric. That's a indicator for action that's needed. And again, thankfully, we don't have to have that conversation, because management takes those triggers very, very seriously.
Thanks. Let's talk now about emerging risks and adaptability, which I think goes along to what you're saying, David. For Brian, for you, how does the audit committee stay informed about emerging risks?
So maybe we can just define those just for a second here. So emerging risks or evolving risks, right? They should be identified either as part of a risk assessment, or maybe it's a separate and distinct emerging risk assessment. But emerging risks are those risks that aren't necessarily being tracked and monitored by the company actively today, but the company needs to be able to see around the corner. I like to say the board needs to be able to see around the corner of what risks are coming at them based on maybe the long-term strategic plan or other triggering events that David and I are referring to. But those are the ones that the board and management needs to get their arms around, because managing and monitoring known risks is one thing, but doing that for unknown risks, which sounds kind of funny, is really challenging. So you got to get your defined emerging risks in the mix somewhere so you can discuss them. Most companies are referring to emerging risks as, let's say, changing regulatory compliance issues, new ways to attack through cyber issues or events, maybe geopolitical through elections that are happening, bringing on new suppliers, having new third-party risks. So anything could be an emerging risk, but the key is to get your arms around it as a board and as an audit committee and as a management team.
Yeah, Brian, to that point on cyber, because it's a great point. To me, it's the known unknown.
Yeah.
And because you're only as good as you are today.
Yes.
Or yesterday, and because it's such a dynamic threat environment. And so we have found it very useful to have outside experts that are that are live and breathe and see the risk world from a very different vantage point, and to give us insights as a in the case of MetLife, it's in the risk and full board, but it also in the risk and finance committee. I find that to be very, very helpful, because it's that outside in perspective that's good for the board, but it's also good for management, right? Because you're able to bring in a caliber of outside expert that is otherwise you couldn't. It's one of those resources you need to rent. It's hard for a board to own something like that.
Absolutely.
David, just to expand on that a little bit, how does the audit committee adapt its approach to risk management in response to industry-specific changes?
Well, it's again, whether it's the audit committee or the finance and risk committee, it's again, the committee has to be adaptable to emerging risks. And I think one of the things that's most important for committees, boards, is to get out in front of it, and don't wait till it's upon you, but get out in front. So if it's changing regulatory environment, there ought to be a very long lead up to that. So it's not just one meeting or because again, as a board, you're not meeting every day. You're meeting very limited times throughout the year, and so it's important to get out in front of emerging risks, new regulatory requirements. That's a big one, and to have as many small bites at it that you can ahead of the time that it becomes a reality. So, I mean, I think there's no easy answer to that, because it is so dynamic. But again, that's why, to Brian's point, it's hard to do, is looking around the corner and trying to identify the things that are on the horizon. And I think good directors avail themselves of networks, of groups, of webinars such as this, programs such as this, where you get to borrow the perspective of many different people and companies and industries to try to hear something that might be applicable to your company.
Yeah, well, it's funny for regulatory, because at least in our world, looking at the PCAOB and the SEC regulations, I know that's only one subset, but we live and breathe it. It doesn't really move that quickly, but obviously it may not be something that everybody is monitoring as closely. So it's easier for example, for me to be familiar with what's coming down the pike. Now, something like CrowdStrike, did people see that coming? I don't know. I would assume not, but maybe cyber experts did. I don't know. Supposedly some people saw the pandemic coming. I mean, that caught me by surprise, but who's to say? Brian, can you talk about what types of risk reporting and monitoring you find effective?
Yeah, when we encourage risk functions to feed into the board, it varies by industry, but you should have the results of the periodic risk assessments clearly. You should have a set of key risk indicators, or KRIs, that help monitor and metric the key business risks and how the company's doing against each risk appetite definition, maybe quarter to quarter, red, yellow, green, however you want to show it or do it in a report. You should have a list of maybe the emerging risks that management is most trying to get their hands around, so you're aware of that as a board or as an audit committee or risk committee. Those are kind of the things that we're seeing flow up to the board, and them using to really ask really good questions back to management about.
David, what do you find most effective in terms of reporting and monitoring?
Well, I think along the lines what Brian talked about, I would reiterate that we have a very robust set of key metrics aligned around the key risks and the metrics and the measures and where we are, with a particular emphasis to double click on the things that are moving, I'll say, closer to a heightened risk. And again, some of those are just the nature of the business, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's interest rate environment, market environment. The as you say, the regulatory risks are more easily identified because you can see them coming, and because there's a whole group in our companies, there's a whole group of compliance oriented people, so you can see those coming. But what you can't see coming are market disruptions, geopolitical risks. I mean, country A invades country B, and all of a sudden you're wondering how you're going to do business in either of those countries. So it's a very dynamic world. You just have to, again, that's why having those standardized reports and metrics, but then again, leaving enough time to borrow the perspective from the directors sitting around that room, because they all see things very different. They're all walking a very diverse background, and they see things. They travel in different circles, and that's the whole beauty of having a very diverse board, is you get to borrow everybody's perspective.
Yeah, you mentioned. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
Sorry, Vanessa. I was just going to say, one other thing that I see starting to sometimes make it to the board, but it's not a normal thing, but I encourage it to be more normal, is something I call risk interconnectivity. A lot of times boards get this list of your top 10, 15, 20 key business risks. They use it to monitor things, but I don't see enough management teams giving the board the connection points between 1 through 20, meaning think back to the pandemic, right? We can all relate to COVID, even though it's lovingly getting farther and farther behind us. But that pandemic risk triggered other risks. It triggered supply chain risk. It triggered talent management risk. So each risk on the key business risk list is not independent of other risks. So if number 14 hits, maybe it triggers number 2. So if the boards understand the dependencies between the risks, I think that'd be a useful exercise for the board to get their arms around. I don't know, David, if you agree with that.
Yeah, what I was going to say, I was going to ask you, what role have you seen stress testing? Again, in the financial services, banking, insurance, stress testing has become, frankly, a way of life.
Yes.
But to your point, it's the interconnectedness of those risks and how a risk manifests itself on one's balance sheet. But that's I've always found those stress tests to be a very, very useful tool to understand how your balance sheet, cash flows,
yes,
customer behavior. I mean, all the things that if you're in a business where customer behavior, choice, optionality could materially affect your business, then you need to understand what are the motivations of your customer to behave a certain way.
That's a great point. That's a great point, David. I was talking to an audit committee member, not the chair, of a non-financial services client on Monday afternoon of this week. And she said to me, I was a CFO at a bank and we did so much stress testing. Why don't non-banks do stress testing? On the income statement or that, whatever, just give me some stress testing results. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, it's a great tool. It's a lot of work to build it, to do it right. But well, I'll tell you, it can tell you a lot about how your balance sheet's going to behave.
That's right.
So just to piggyback on that, and then we're going to do our last polling question. Both, maybe Brian, with you first. If you're a non-financial company, though, do you think that company, I know this is a generalization, but has the internal resources? Because David's talking about the stress testing. I would assume that you need a certain group of individuals who have that experience, and expertise. So, is that going to be Is it common to have that, or does that need to be built in a non-financial services company? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I don't think it's normal in non-financial services just yet. I think his point and my point was it should be done in the non-banking environments. You get some analysts within the finance group who understand it, can probably do it. Some auditors can do it. So I think it's not an excuse to say we don't have the right kind of people. You can get the right people, but you can learn so much on the back end of stress testing, scenario analysis, and things that banks do all the time for non-banks.
Okay. Well, let's launch our next polling question. David, you had mentioned external experts. So let's see what our audience says. Does the board, in your experience, seek external expertise related to their ERM assessment? And that could be, anything. Could be identification of the risk that I think, David, you were alluding to. Perhaps it's stress testing. Let's give that a minute and we'll share those results. I'm going to ask Brian, we have about 10 minutes left. We want to do some Q&A. So before we go to Q&A, are there some questions, and I know there's a lot, so you can maybe talk about your resource also, that you would suggest boards ask management to help with their maybe ERM broadly, but especially identification of emerging risks?
Yeah, that's a great way to ask it to Vanessa, because the best thing boards can do is ask questions. So putting it in question format is what we tend to do when we're advising boards. So if you think about emerging risks, questions could be, how are we identifying our emerging risks, unknown risks? Are we doing a separate risk assessment? Are we just guessing what they might be? So give me the approach for that management. How would our risk profile change if we got hit with one of the emerging risks we are tracking? Like, David, have you done scenario analysis around that? Give me the triggering events that you are tracking my management team, so you know when you have to worry about something changing our risk profile. So what are the triggering events? You could say, how are we monitoring specific emerging risks? How are we monitoring regulatory compliance risks? How are we monitoring cybersecurity risks? How are we monitoring third-party risks? The things that are typically in the emerging bucket. So you can ask very specific or general questions just to get management talking about what they're doing, and you can learn a lot just from that process.
Great. Let's share results quickly. We have, about a third folks say yes, third say no, and the other group is either not applicable, they don't know. So mixed across the board there. For David, can you talk? We have a question in the chat asking about resources, to learn more about ERM. Either of you, maybe we'll start with David. Any recommendations?
I'd call Brian.
There we go. Good idea. Brian, I know PwC has a director's guide to ERM fundamentals. We can put a link to that in the chat. Any other resources?
Yeah, we have a group within the firm called the Governance Insights Center, which is where I work a lot of the time. And it's a group that does nothing but puts out guidance and advisories for boards and audit committees and risk committees to know what questions to ask, to encourage them to look at their companies in certain ways. So if you just go onto the website, you can probably tap into a number of resources like the one you'll put in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to quickly go to a couple of the questions in the chat, in the Q&A. One is about comp. So could you talk about the relationship between ERM and executive compensation risk? How does this impact the relationship between the audit committee and the compensation committee? I don't know if either one of you wants to.
Yeah, I'll start, Brian. You can jump in. Again, I'm giving you my view from a regulated enterprise. So our ERM does an annual risk assessment of the compensation of the incentive compensation, not relative to where are people in pay ranges and market comp, et cetera, but it's about the incentives, the motivations inside the various short-term and long-term plans. And so it's a, if you will, an independent view about excessive risk taking. So by its very nature, does the program incentivize, reward, a disproportionate reward for extraordinary results that could, if you will, again, I try to simplify it, that would encourage or reward good people to do bad things.
Yeah.
And so, said very simply, so it's a very specific, intentional annual review. And so I think that's part of the design. And it's not just ERM doing it in a vacuum. There are the people that are designing the program, the people that are setting the metrics. It's an integrated and connected ecosystem that helps design and set the targets. So that's been my experience with it. Brian?
Yeah, I'll hit something very similar, David. When we go into a company, we assess the risk culture of the company, whether it's for the board or for management. To David's point, you want to look at how is good risk-taking behavior incentivized. And when you do your performance management of employees or of management itself, is good risk-taking or good risk behaviors part of that assessment? It should be, because that sets the right risk culture for the company. So it's really connected to risk culture, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. And the setting of targets, it's as much artistry as it is science, because again, you're as a board, and it met. I sit on the comp committee as well, as do the other committee chairs, but it's always trying to strike the right balance of having challenging targets that are, they're, at the one extreme, they're not layups by any stretch of the means, but they're also not so far out of reach that in order to reach them, you have to do something unnatural to get there. Right. And so it's that I'm giving you the extremes so that you get a feel for how to try to find striking that right balance, that they're challenging, but not so much so that are gonna force good people to do bad things.
Yeah, great point.
Brian, maybe this is common knowledge, but I'll ask it since I'm less familiar with it. You mentioned good risk taking.
Yeah.
I think I know what you mean by that, but can you expand a little bit on that? I assume that is opposed to a bad risk taking behavior.
Yeah. The way I would describe it is, in its simplest form, is that when people in the business are making decisions, whether they're decisions about new products and services or which vendor to engage or whatever decision or what person to hire, right? They have to do that with a risk management lens. Because if they do that, then they're thinking about risk behavior all the time. So instead of making decisions, make risk-informed decisions, regardless of what the topic is. That's how I would describe that, just in a very high-level aspect.
It seems in hindsight, you can always, when the risk-taking behavior works out, you can say, oh, that was brilliant. It was a great risk you just took, versus when it blows up. We do have one more, we have several more questions, but we're going to run out of time. So we'll take a look at these and try to think about them for potential next another webinar. But one question we have, and we can, Brian, would you see reputational risk as a level 1 risk? You had mentioned strategic, financial, operational, and also compliance. So where does reputational risk fit in?
I get that question really often because it's a great question if you really think about it. So there's no right or wrong answer, but here's my belief, and I would love to hear David's as well. I don't believe reputation is a risk that belongs on a risk taxonomy. I believe reputation or bad reputation is an outcome of bad risk taking. In other words, within strategic risk, could you stick reputation as one of the level 2 risks? You could. I would put brand there instead and have reputation be an outcome of any risk going bad. You would have a bad reputational risk issue. That's how I think about it. David, any different?
I think that's right. companies, and I'm sure represented on this call, spend a lifetime building and protecting their firm's brand, reputation, customer relationships, etc. And so you know what a good reputation looks like, and you have it right up until the minute you don't, until something goes right. And it's usually, you're right, Brian, it's a reputational damage is the result of some other risk, behavior, etc. happening and occurring. So it's something you guard, but it's not a control per se.
That's right.
Well, with that, I think that's a great topic or point to end on. I do want to remind our audience that we will provide you CPE. You don't have to do anything. You'll get your CPE certificate if you answer the polling questions in via your email. It does take a couple weeks, so be patient. Before we end, Brian, any closing thoughts for the audience? And then David, I'll end with you.
I guess I would say a couple of quick things. One is, when it comes to discharging your board or audit committee risk oversight responsibility, assuming you're a board member on the call here, just know that your company's ERM program has to go way beyond the risk assessment process. You've got to have risk governance, you've got to have risk appetite, you've got to have risk mitigation, you've got to have the right roles and responsibilities across the 3 lines, all the things that David and I talked about today. And then I would just say, remember that ERM, in my opinion, is a critical component of a company's corporate governance framework. So quite frankly, treat it as such. It's important.
Thanks. David?
Yeah, just I agree with Brian's comments. So often as a director, we are relying on company culture, tone from the top to set the right framework for the right balance of risk management. Because again, in your business, you're having to take risk to make money, and so you're now trying to mitigate the downside outcomes of, if Brian called it, bad risk. So in any event, pay attention to culture because it does matter.
Well, thank you so much for joining, and join us for our next webinar, which we'll have in the 4th quarter, late October. We're going to do another, we're going to follow up on the artificial and AI, generative AI topic we had earlier in January.